Welcome to Jason's completion seminar. It is agreed protocol with BRAC that country be acknowledged on formal occasions. I don't know whether this is a formal occasion or not. It's an important one. If it's formal, I'm not dressed for it. But to be on the safe side, the university acknowledges the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which this activity takes place, and its elders, their elders, past, present, and emerging. So it's a great pleasure to see Jason reach this point. Jason has had the courage, the talent, and the tenacity to take on a really hard problem in cognitive psychology and the modelling of memory and decision-making, which has required him to learn a whole lot of really complicated technical stuff that he probably didn't envisage when he took it on. And to his total credit, he has persevered with that. And as a supervisor, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Adam as well, it's remarkable to see where he has come in the time that he's been working with us. So it's a great pleasure now to hand the floor over to Jason to tell you what he's been doing.
Well, thanks very much for those words, Philip. I will say it's probably less courage and more ignorance of what was required. All right. I guess in the spirit of thanks, I'd like to thank my supervisors, Philip and Adam. As Philip alluded to, I think this project is not one that I envisaged myself doing as a history major in undergrad, but here I find myself doing maths psych. They've been really patient and great mentors and guides through a somewhat arcane field, I would say. I'd also like to thank Simon, who has been in Vanderbilt for the last couple of years, but prior to that was the postdoc in the Vision and Attention Lab, that's Philip's lab. And a lot of the code that I'm about to present, or a lot of the experiments and the modeling was built on code that he developed, so just worth acknowledging that. Oh, and he's also the co-author on one of the first papers. But yeah, wouldn't be possible with any of these people. So the title of my talk is Source Memory is Thresholded, and I'm presenting evidence from circular diffusion modeling of continuous outcome tasks. There's a lot there, but I'm hoping that we'll all understand what that means in a moment, or in a few moments, maybe too many moments. Okay, what are we doing here? All right, so source memory is sort of the subject of interest, and that's defined as information about the origins of some information or items in memory. So the example I have here is, you might recognize this bloke, pretty famous, and it's probably pretty easy to say that you know him from the Harry Potter films, Daniel Radcliffe. It might be a little harder with this guy, so also a pretty familiar looking face for some, I would hope, but it's probably a little bit harder to say where you know him from. I know him from a lot of really great Westerns. He was in The Big Lebowski and also shows like Parks and Rec. And I think also the Yellowstone prequel, which I haven't watched, but is apparently quite good. Maybe when I finish my PhD. But yeah, that's Sam Elliott, and he's an example of someone who might be familiar, but a little harder to give a source for. So what I hope that illustrates is this difference between recognition, which in more formal terms, you can think of that as was an item previously encountered or not, and a source task, which is where I ask you what movie the person was from, what was the origin. So a lot of effort, a lot of work has gone into distinguishing and trying to figure out how these two are different and what might be driving differences in those two tasks. So one of the big questions in episodic memory is how retrieval from memory works. And there are a couple schools of thought. The first kind of model is one that says that memory strength varies continuously and retrieval precision, so the accuracy of your retrieved information, varies continuously with that strength. And I'll give you a more concrete example shortly. The other is to say memory is kind of discrete. It works in this thresholded way. And you either remember something or you don't. And again, I'll have an example. And another class of models says that different sorts of mechanisms are involved with different sorts of tasks. So to give you a bit more of a concrete grasp of what I'm on about, imagine this glass is in your noggin. It represents something about your brain, and you got some information in there, and that's the water. In a threshold model, we say there's this limit, there's this red line. And if the level of information doesn't reach that threshold, then you don't have anything retrieved. You don't know anything. And it doesn't matter how close it gets to the red line. As long as it's not over, it's still nothing. But as soon as we tip over, we get this nice green tick. Yeah, I remember. In contrast, in a continuous model, we have this little bit of water translates to a little bit of a small tick. And as the information gets better, you have better and better retrieval. So that's a continuous model. So one of the most influential models in this space is the Yonelinas 1999 dual process model. I think that's 97 actually. Well, the idea here is that there are two things going on in your brain, two tools we have. One is familiarity, which is a continuous signal. So like how familiar something is. And the other is recollection, which is this rich, almost like reliving of the episode. Like I can remember exactly where I was and who I was with and how I felt, whatever. So the explanation that Yonelinas gave is when you're doing a recognition task. So yeah, recognizing Daniel Radcliffe, for example, familiarity can help you. So if it's close enough, if familiarity is strong enough, then you say, yep, I recognize that. But you can also remember exactly the movie you've seen him in, the whole the episode, and that will also help you in doing a recognition task. So both contribute there. But when you're doing a source task, it doesn't really matter how familiar something is. It doesn't help you. So that's kind of what the Sam Elliott thing was meant to show. It doesn't help you say where you know him from. So that's kind of the idea. Oh, and that's just there to remind me to say that there's some evidence that shows that stuff like aging impacts the performance in these different tasks differently. And the story there was because people are, because aging disproportionately impacts performance in source tasks, maybe recollection is being impacted more. So I don't have too much to say about that, other than to say there are real life reasons why we would care about this sort of thing. So that all kind of hinges on this premise that, so is source memory actually thresholded? Okay, so that's the big question. How do we answer that? Well, in prior decades, people used frequently these two-choice tasks. So in a source task, that might be, was this word presented on the left side of the screen or right side of the screen? Was the speaker male or female? And there was some disadvantage to that I won't get too into, but I'm happy to be pressed on later. But more recently, there have been the advent of these continuous outcome tasks, or actually the rediscovery of continuous outcome tasks, in which people make responses on a continuous domain. So, and the big advantage of that is rather than getting this somewhat crude percentage of correct responses, you get this rich measurement of precision. So how close they were, rather than just were they right or not. So frequently used in visual working memory tasks. So for example, from Smith 2020, Smith et al. 2020, people are making judgments about the color of a noisy patch in the middle, and they click somewhere on the outside of a color circle. And Harlow and Donaldson, who I'll talk a bit more about in a second, did this with the locations of words. And that's a paradigm that I built upon. So what that looked like was people are shown words positioned somewhere along the circumference of a circle. And then when cued with the word, they just represent, or they try and give you where the location was. And as I said, you get this degree of error rather than a proportion correct. So what does that bias, what does it look like? Well, so because we're talking in a circular space, error goes from negative pi to pi, 180 degrees either way. So 0 in the middle is a very accurate response. So imagine on a circle like this, the little yellow thing is the target. A response that's pretty close to the yellow target has pretty low error, so it goes in the middle there. One a bit further away ends up a bit further away on the x-axis there, and even further away you get this extreme, almost 180. And that flips the other way if you go the other way around the circle. Okay. So what what error typically looks like in a task like the one I showed is like this. We describe it as this leptokurtic or peaky, heavy-tailed distribution. And the job for us is to explain where this comes from. So one explanation is remembering back about the threshold of things, so you either know it or you don't. We say that there are a proportion of items that we hold in memory, and this is distributed normally. It's technically a von Mises distribution because it's circular, but just think of it as a normal Gaussian curve. So there's a bit of noise there. And then there are items that we don't know anything about and we guess them. So those give you those extreme errors. So two parts, right? And that's a thresholded explanation of how we get this data. Right, so I wasn't sure about the audience today, so I thought I would just take a moment to talk briefly about just the idea of modeling and why we would want to do any of this. So we can explain that figure just now in a sentence. So to say responses are a mixture of memory responses, which are normally distributed, and guesses, which are uniformly distributed. We can express that with an equation, which looks scary, but only has a few working parts. There's a bit here which says there's this normal distribution. The theta wearing a hat is the thing you were trying to remember. The theta is what you gave, so you get this distance degree of error. And we say, what's the probability of seeing that from a von Mises distribution, a normal distribution with a mean of 0? The other part is this 1/2 pi, which is the flat across the range of the circle. So those are the two parts of the model. And then we have two little things that I haven't explained. The first is this kappa, this k, which represents the precision of the normal distribution, so how wide it is. And the other is this beta, which, as you can see, it is a coefficient for the two parts. And you can think of that as like a seesaw between the two parts of the model. So how much one is contributing versus the other. So visually, if we increase precision, you get a taller, narrower peak. And if we increase the guessing, bring up the tail. So all we're really doing when I say modeling is I'm giving the equation to a computer and saying, these are the two things I want you to fiddle those dials until we get a good fit to the data. Cool. So that's a pretty simple model, 2 free parameters. There'll be more to come. So what I explained there is essentially the Harlow and Donaldson thresholded model, where there are two components. I won't go over that again. And in their 2013 paper, which kind of instigated a lot of my project, they found that a threshold model was a better account of the data than a continuous one. Okay. So from that point, you can think of my thesis as sort of a series of challenges to this point of view. So is this a good model? Is this a good explanation? So in study 1, I had 2 questions, one easy one and one a bit harder. So we'll start with the easy one. The first was, could source guesses simply be due to a failure of recognition? So yeah, so I'll get to that later. So the idea here is there's some work, I've chucked some citations down there, which suggests that when people don't recognize the item you're asking them about, they don't have any source information, or they don't have any source discriminability in the 2-choice task. So the problem for that, or the reason why I mentioned that, is if it's the case that you don't have source information for unrecognized items, well, if there are some items which are unrecognized in that plot, then it doesn't necessarily say anything about a source retrieval threshold. It might just be there are some items that you don't have source information for. Subtle difference, but it's an important one. So the question more concretely is, are those heavy tails, are those simply unrecognized items? So I'll take a moment now to explain the paradigm in a bit more detail, and we'll return to that question. So in the experiment, there were 4 phases. The first phase was one where people studied stuff. So they were shown a location, shown a word that was associated with that location, and then they had to reproduce it. So 2 things to note. The first is the reason they had to reproduce the location immediately, this is not a memory task, it was just to make sure that they encoded it correctly. There's another explanation which says, okay, maybe guessing is just things that people didn't see properly or encode properly. We added this in here just to make sure that we can make sure at some point that was in the noggin. All right. The other thing is, it might strike you as a bit odd that whoops. It might strike you as a bit odd that we had this sort of location and then a word pairing. That's something I'll pick up on study 2, so keep that in the back of your heads. But that's what they saw in this study. So in the second phase, people had this rather difficult arithmetic task. And the idea there is just to clear the buffer, give them something to think about. In a recognition phase, which followed that, people were shown the cue words, and then they had to rate the items on how confident they were that they recognized it. So this is the key part that tackles that question. So by collecting these recognition ratings on each of the words, we can categorize the stimuli in the source task and see what that looks like. And yeah, the source task you should be familiar with by now. So returning to the question, are those blue responses just unrecognized items? Well, when we looked at the source responses for the items that were rated 3 or lower on the 6-point scale, so we say that as unrecognized, we replicate what the literature suggests, that there's pretty low source discriminability, it's pretty flat, you don't have a lot of information. And that holds as well for these 2 items that were recognized with fairly low confidence, also pretty flat. But when we jump to the items that people said, yep, I'm sure I've seen this before, it looks like that. And the takeaway here is, yes, unrecognized items seem to be uniform, but that doesn't really explain how heavy the tails are in the on the left panel there. Right, so the answer to the first question was no, people still seem to guess, or they still seem to have the tails when we look at items recognized with high confidence. That was the easy one. The second question was, could this heavy-tailed error distribution simply reflect something about the decision-making process rather than a memory one? And this requires a bit more setup, so bear with me. So I showed you this earlier, the Harlow and Donaldson explanation. What we're doing here is we're saying there's something about the structure of memory, and we're assuming that it maps directly onto what we see in the response. There is a reason why that might be problematic, and that is in order to make any response, people need to make decisions. So you can think of this in terms of a flowchart. People are drawing stuff from memory, they're making a decision about it, and then they're giving it a response. So if there's anything about the decision-making that changes or transforms what we see, then we need to be able to account for it. In a bit more concrete terms, responses are subject to decision processes, which A, are subject to error in themselves, so it's a source of variability, and they also occur over time. There's been work done in the recognition. This is just one example among many from Ratcliffe and Starnes, where people made conclusions on the basis of response outcomes, which were changed when people considered response times as well. And the reason why that happened is when you separate these different sources of noise. So there's a thing you're interested in, which is what information guy is responding. And there's another part, which is what amount of information you need in order to give a response. And by separating those 2 things out, conclusions can change. I won't get too much into that, but again, happy to be pressed on that. So that's all well and good, but it was, you need to have a model then of the decision-making process. And the Smith 2016 circuit diffusion model is an example of that. I chose not to include the equations here, but rest assured, they're happening in the background. Believe me, spent a long time trying to understand it, but I think on a conceptual level, it's pretty intuitive. The idea is there's this circle, which represents the decision space. And the red dot there is an evidence accumulator, which starts in the middle, which means there's no particular, it's in the middle, it doesn't have anything. So the assumption here is that decision-making is a noisy process, a noisy evidence accumulation process. So at one time step, the accumulator might move towards the bottom of the circle there. At the next time step, because of noise, it might move a little bit to the right. And over the course of these many, many time steps, the accumulator eventually hits the circumference of the circle, which represents the amount of information needed to give a response. And you get 2 things. You get the outcome, which is where the accumulator hit, and you get response time, which is how long it took to get there. Righto. So, so the thing that I want to focus on is this drift norm, which is the rate at which the red dot moved there. And what that represents is, you can think of that as the quality of information driving the process. So the better your evidence quality, the faster that's going to move. So that's something that can vary from trial to trial. So imagine in one case, you've got pretty good evidence. You have a high drift rate. That dot's going to move pretty quick and it's going to reach a point. But on a lower drift trial, it's a bit slower. It's a bit more subject to noise. And even though the underlying angle is the same, it might end up drifting a bit further away. So on average, what you get is these high drift trials, which have higher precision, so greater accuracy, with faster response times, and low drift trials, which have lower precision and slower response times. So why I'm telling you all this? Well, when you average across these trials, so here on the top there, we've got high drift trials, so very precise. They're associated with pretty fast response times. You get low ones, which are a bit worse in accuracy and they're slower. But if you average across, you get this blue line, which notably looks pretty similar. It starts to look pretty similar to the red threshold explanation there. The key thing here is we're producing the same sort of shape without any reference to a memory threshold. Okay, so if we can explain the responses we see using this variable drift account, then we need not invoke some memory threshold. Right. So the way we explored that was to compare two models, actually three, but we'll say two. The first was a variable drift model, which, as I explained, has drift rate that varies from trial to trial. And the other was a threshold model, which had a fixed drift rate for some trials, and then this zero drift. Oh, I think I had a zero drift process where it's just noise driving the little dot. So a mixture of these two processes. So a reminder, that's what the data looks like. That's what we're trying to get. And this is how the models did. So what should jump out at you right away is that the red line, that is the threshold model, is doing quite a bit better than the blue line, both in terms of the response accuracy and the response times, which is on the left and right, respectively. And we can zoom out there, see across participants, and don't bother squinting too hard. The point I'm trying to make here is that participants vary quite a lot, but the red line is doing quite a bit better across participants. So what's the deal, right? I just wasted 5 minutes of your life telling you about how this blue line should be able to do it. You know, what a scam. Well, to explain why we don't see that, we have to look at the relationship between response times and response error. So again, that's the familiar old distribution of response errors. We don't really care which direction they got it wrong in. So we can just kind of fold it over itself and say, let's express it in terms of absolute error. There are good responses on the left, bad responses on the right. And we can summarize this in terms of percentiles or quantiles. So the red line there, everything to the left of it are the most accurate 10% of responses, the next accurate 20%, so on and so forth. And now this one's just for Sasha. We can, oh, I'm sorry, fold out. So the red area represents the fastest 10%. Okay, so we can push this over and look at response times for each bin. So the red area is associated with a distribution of response times. So is the green area, the blue, and the brownish thing. That's a pretty ugly plot. We don't like having this many dimensions. So we can summarize the response times in terms of percentiles or quantiles as well. So there are the faster ones and slower ones. So squashing those down now and compressing it back into this familiar old 2D space, that red square represents where the fastest 10% of the most accurate 10% responses are. So these are RT quantiles conditioned on the error quantile or percentile. And the same for each of the different bins. So remembering what I said about what the variable precision model predicts, we should expect slower response times for less accurate responses. Well, if that was the case, we would expect to see something like this, a sort of gradual bowing up, this movement of the quantile. So responses get slower, going down to up, as we go from less accurate to more accurate to less accurate, left to right. Okay, so that's what we expect, and that's what the data shows. So the blue line, that's the variable model, and it says, as I explained, this expects this gradual bowing up, but it's not really what we see. there's a bit of a sharp slowing in the slowest responses, the triangles there, but you don't really see that in the other quantiles. In fact, it even maybe gets a bit faster. Won't put too much stock into that. Again, you can zoom out and see that there's a great deal of individual variability, but again, across the board, the red line is doing a better job than the blue line. So the takeaway there is we didn't get it, right, with just variable precision in decision making. So it well could have been the case that adding this response time story changed the whole interpretation, but because the response time quantiles didn't show what we expect to see, it seems like this diffusion model with a mixture component is still preferred over those without a mixture component. So people still seem to guess when we take into account noise in decision making. Okay, so that's study one. But there's more. In study two, we thought a bit deeper about what we were asking people to do. So I mentioned earlier this thing about showing locations in words, right? So what that looked like, again, was people saw a location and that was associated with a word like cook, another word associated with a word like ping. So that's not maybe the most intuitive way of thinking about items and sources. Maybe instead we should present words in locations. So have them simultaneously presented in terms of the item and source. So maybe by presenting things sequentially like that, we were changing the task or making it somehow more difficult to associate the two bits of information. And maybe that's why we saw the heavy tails. So we ran a second experiment where people had this across participants condition where people saw them either in sequential or simultaneous and compared the distribution of errors across conditions. And this is what we saw, pretty similar. I think you'd agree. Like maybe the simultaneous conditions got a little bit higher accuracy, but really the heavy tails are still there in both. So it doesn't really explain the shape of the distribution overall. So it doesn't seem to really matter how we present the stimuli. That was the easy one. The second question is, okay, well, what if some of these guesses aren't really guesses? What if instead people are just getting confused about what you're asking them about? So what I'm referring to here are intrusion errors. And the idea is, again, like you're asking people about something and they're giving you information for another thing. This sort of thing happens in a lot of different memory tasks. So it's also known by a lot of different names. So intrusion errors is one way you could put it. In visual working memory, people often talk about swap errors, so swapping different items, or transpositions in a list, or yeah, anyway, the idea kind of is all the same, that you get this sort of substitutional intrusion. So in my task, what that might look like is, say you're shown these three words in locations, and you ask where chord was located. Well, you might have this distribution around the target, but you might also get it mixed up and have these distributions centered on the non-target items. So the important thing here is on any single trial, these intrusions aren't uniform. They're systematically tied to all where the non-targets were presented. So it's not really guessing. But because we distribute all the different angles across the experiment randomly, if you look across all the different trials, it starts to resemble guessing in that it's uniformly distributed relative to the target. So this is something that Paul Bayes has argued extensively on in the visual working memory literature. And this work is kind of inspired heavily by that. So it's pretty important if we're going to say anything about how much people guess that we distinguish between intrusions and guessing. So how do we do that? Well, in the plots I've been showing you, if flag was the word, then we've been plotting the response error. That is the degree between the red thing. Instead, what we can do is plot the distance between the given angle and each of the non-target angles. So all the words that we weren't asking them about, we can plot all of those instead. And what that looks like in my task is something like this. So if intrusions didn't happen, right? If items never intruded with each other, you would expect no relationship between the non-target angles and the response angle. Instead, you get this little peak, this little hint of central tendency. And what that tells you is that there are a proportion of trials which end up closer to the non-targets than you would expect to happen by chance. Yep, so we can model that by comparing models. So the first was the pure guess model, our old friend from study 1. The second was a pure intrusion model, which made this very strong claim that there are no guesses at all, they're all intrusions. And the third model was a hybrid, so it had both components. So this is how the models fit to data. So that there are that's the response outcomes. And you'll see the pure guess, that's the threshold model from earlier, and the green one, which is the hybrid, they are very similar. They're basically sitting on top of each other. But the pure intrusion model's really struggling. It's not getting the peak of the central peak. We can flip over now in panel B and consider those recentered errors. So what I mean by that is the distance between the response angle and each of the non-targets, right? So that central tendency. And the pure guess model, which assumes no relationship between non-targets and responses, it's predicting a flat line. But that's not what we see. There's a bit of a peak, and the pure intrusion and the hybrid model are able to pick that up. So the story I'm trying to sell here is you seem to need both. You need a bit of intrusions, a bit of guessing in order to account for both patterns of data simultaneously. So intrusions do happen, but seemingly so do guesses. We thought we would dig a bit deeper here and really think about intrusions. So the idea was that, okay, sometimes you mix items up with each other. You would think then intuitively that if items were more similar to each other, they should be more easy to mix up. Okay, so there should be this similarity driven component to why intrusions happen. So items can be similar in a lot of different ways. The first one we looked at was just temporal similarity. So this is something that has been looked at very extensively in the memory literature at large. I've got just a handful of a very limited selection of a much wider field, which has shown that people. Oh, second, I'll expand on this. When people do free recall, so when people are shown a list of words and they're giving them back to you in any order they wish, they tend to do it in order. So if they start with allo, the next one they probably say is grab. So they organize items spontaneously according to temporal contiguity is what it's called. But in serial recall tasks where people have to give things in a certain order, when they get it wrong, they tend to get it wrong in a very systematic way. So if I was meant to say grab, but I didn't, I'm probably pretty likely to say root instead. And that's more likely than getting it wrong and saying mugs. Right, so we express similarity in terms of distance, I should say, distance and time in terms of lag. So given the target was Cove, we say that's got a lag of 0 because it was a target. Pups was 1 ahead of it, so it's got a lag of 1, and the words, pretty intuitive. So what this means for us is, in the model I was presenting, that green line, we were saying that it doesn't matter what the lag was, the intrusion probability was the same. So you can think of this as a flat gradient of intrusion likelihood across lags. A temporal model might instead say something like this, which says that items with a lag of 1, either way, are more likely to intrude than items with further lags. We modeled this using this exponential decay function. So what that says is temporal similarity T is this decays exponentially as a function of lag. And that's something that's been commonly found in, right. So the reason I've split the plot up there in terms of negative and positive is one of the things that have been seen in the work I alluded to earlier, from Mike Kahana's lab in particular, was this idea of this temporal asymmetry in the contiguity effect. So items that occur after tend to be seen as being more similar than items that occurred before. So we can build that into our model as well by having this this tau parameter, this tau dial, that kind of changes how the two parts seesaw. And there's this other parameter which controls how quickly they drop off. Okay. And I thought it'd be worth mentioning here is recent work from Popov and colleagues. They looked at intrusions or swap errors in a task very similar to mine, what they did was they modeled the likelihood of each non-target intruding as a free parameter. So every single item had its own little dial for probability. And when you plot it, it looks like the black line there. So what we're saying here is we can capture that systematically in a much more principled way by saying this is exponential drop-off. So it's a more principled explanation of what we know to be probably out there. Oops, ouch. Bang the table. We also did that for spatial similarity as well. So a very similar idea. I won't belabor the point, but the blue thing is more likely to intrude than the green thing. And we can also multiply that with temporal similarity to mix it all up and let that control intrusions. And we did that for the features of the words as well, but I'll get to that. So at the level of the marginal plot, so this is just response times and response errors, by incorporating the spatial temporal component, we got this improvement in fit. That's not really satisfying. We don't really know why that's happening. So we can dig a bit deeper in the recentered plots. So I've changed the colors unhelpfully, but the red line is the green line from before. That's not too interesting. Don't squint too hard. It gets interesting when we think about lag. So by splitting that plot into the lags, so the far top left panel is the recentered plots for items with non-targets for lag of 1. And what you'll see is as we increase lag, the central tendency, the peak, gets a bit lower. So intrusions are strongest from a lag of 1, a bit weaker from a lag of 3. And looking at the negative direction, pretty hard to compare because of how I've shown it, but it's a bit weaker in that direction. And the gradient models are doing a pretty good job of picking that up, whereas the flat model says that there should be no effect, and that's not doing a good job there. So that's what's really driving the improvement there. Oh yes, the stuff I was showing earlier was just models to response error. We also fit it with a diffusion variant. I won't dwell on this too much. It's just to say that we see a similar pattern in the response time quantiles, and it's doing a decent job when you consider that it's being constrained by the response times. So to summarize study 2, it seems like it doesn't really matter how the stimuli are presented, sequential, simultaneous, we still get heavy tails. And it seems like, yes, some intrusions do occur, but even accounting for them, there are some guesses in the mix. Just to expand on that a bit more, it's likely, given what we saw in study 2, that the model in study 1 and the previous work in the literature likely overestimated the proportion of guesses, given that some of them are probably intrusions. And we found some evidence that spatial temporal similarity influences or drives the prevalence of these intrusions. It's being driven by the similarity. Now, something I kind of brushed upon was we also looked at features of the words as well. So I talked a lot about how items are presented, when they're presented, where they're presented, but items can be similar, words can be similar in terms of their own features as well. So what they mean and how they look. We added those parts in a similar way of exponential drop-off, and we didn't find any evidence for a contribution of those features, which was somewhat surprising. And that drove us to do study 3, which kind of drills down into this point. So the question here was, can factors other than spatial temporal similarity affect the intrusions? Now, across the memory literature, again, there's a lot of evidence which shows that erroneous responses tend to be similar across different tasks and across different kinds of similarity. So I thought the most accessible example would be the DRM, the rhodogrammatic dermot, where people had this false memory for words that were very semantically related. So you're very likely to recall doctor when you're shown nurse, hospital, classic undergrad stuff, right? Same kind of thing has been seen with phonology. So that's a perceptual part, like how words sound. Yeah, things that were perceptually similar are likely to have false recall as well. And we see this in the free recall tasks and serial recall. I won't dwell on this, but again, feel free to push me. I might grumble about it afterwards. So given all this wealth of literature, maybe it was the case that orthography and semantics did influence intrusions, but the overall similarity was so low that the effect was really weak and wasn't picked up by the modeling. So if that's the case, then if we manipulate the level of similarity, then we should start to see an effect. So that's the idea here. So we had 3 different conditions, and this was now within subjects manipulation, where people were shown blocks of words which were either orthographically related, so swapping a few characters here and there, semantically related in terms of meaning, or they were just not related, and that's kind of like what we showed them in the previous study. That was study 2. So what happens when we compare these different conditions? So this here is now stepping away briefly from source memory and just looking at the recognition judgment. So that was when they rated items old, new, on that 6-point scale. It was kind of just a sanity check, really, because a lot of this effects of similarity have been looked at in recognition tasks, and it seems like our manipulation is working. So there's not really a big difference across conditions in how likely people are to say, to correctly say old items were old. Nice save. That's pretty flat. But where the big difference is in the false alarms. So this is saying new items were actually old. There's not a huge effect between unrelated and semantic words, but you see there's a big increase in false alarms when items were orthographically related. So looking at the source judgments now, sort of a similar pattern. So the semantic and unrelated source errors look pretty similar to each other, but the orthography is noticeably a bit lower in the precision and a bit higher in the tails. So there's a bit of nuance that I'm glossing over here in terms of the strength of the manipulations and what's happening at an individual level. But just for now, we'll say this is the pattern. And if we look at the recentered plots as well, we get a bit more insight. So there's a stronger peak on the left there for the orthography. You're getting more intrusions with the orthographic lists compared to the others. So if we show people orthographic lists, they're getting more mix-ups, they're getting more intrusions and low accuracy. So in order for the model to pick that up, we have to incorporate orthography into the model. And that's kind of just to show you that the model's doing a pretty good job when we account for that. So the takeaway there was that the similarity of the item features, so orthography, can affect the prevalence of intrusions. And what that suggests about our previous finding in study 2, so circling back to that, it's probably not the case. So we're not saying that item features don't influence intrusions. It was probably just a bit too weak there, and that when we bring it out in the stimuli, we start to see an effect there. So, as you would expect. So just to wrap everything up, so we started by saying, okay, what about recognition? And recognition didn't do it. It didn't matter if we conditioned on levels of item recognition, we still saw guessing. We considered variability in the drift, in the decision process. That didn't do it. It looked like we still needed this mixture with a uniform distribution. We considered how words were presented simultaneously, sequential. That didn't matter. It seemed like it was still kind of the same across the conditions. And when we had intrusions, yes, that explains some of the guesses, but not all of them. And that held even when we improved the intrusion component by adding these similarity gradients, which I thought was pretty cool. So that's kind of where we leave off. Those are the overall findings. And so over the course of all these different challenges, it seems like the threshold of model or the threshold of explanation of responding seems to hold. Yeah, thank you very much.
So thank you, Jason, for elegant work and beautiful presentation. We didn't get you to the tutorial on slide preparation. So I'm just going to open it up to the floor and let you field questions as you wish.
Yeah, I think we have quite a bit of time.
And if people have questions, staying the microphone to send it on. You want to handle the microphone back there? Yeah.
Thanks, Meredith and Paul. Okay, great.
Did you ever try using a kind of a lore word in your setup? So one that is kind of deliberately highly similar to see if you get that recentered thing.
To get that higher, do you mean? Or...
Yes, to see if you could actually force an intrusion from a highly similar word.
Okay, I think, thank you for the question. Let me just pass that. I think it's pretty hard to tell what's intruding. So sometimes they don't know. And that's the reason why we had to do this modeling rather than just ask them what they were thinking of, because it is kind of hard to tell. It does seem like the more similar item is, the more likely it is to intrude. That's what the gradient model told us.
So there was no pattern in terms of, so when you showed that kind of recentered,
Yes.
the error distances, whatever they were, there was no kind of pattern where a word that was maybe more orthographically similar or phonetically similar tended to be the source of confusion for those participants. Did you ever kind of at a trial by trial level?
Not on a trial by trial level. There was a plot, I think, where I had the recentered plots conditional levels of lag. I didn't show this, but we did that on levels of orthographic similarity and semantic similarity, etc. And we did see a sort of similar drop off in those facets. Not so much in the semantics, actually. But yeah, we looked at that across trials, and that's kind of where the different factors are improving the model. That's where you see the improvement. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason, for a really clear talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you just a little bit more about why you really think there's a threshold. So in particular, can you tell me what about your results rules out the following kind of interpretation? Suppose that there's a continuous memory signal. On every trial, there's some probability that an item is actually retrieved, and it's a higher probability if the memory signal is stronger and weaker. And if you have the freedom to adjust kind of the functional form of that, the function that maps memory strength to probability of retrieval in this particular trial, what stops you from getting the heavy tail kind of plots that you were showing?
Okay. I think I'll capitulate right away and say I don't have any strong marriage to the threshold idea. I will say that one of the things, and I hope this gets at your question, one of the things that came in one of our recent papers was, was this idea that you can have these different functions that it doesn't have to be normal distribution, right? Like it can be different kinds of shapes. And the response we gave to that was whether or not there's a meaningful psychological difference between an item retrieved with like really low precision versus guessing. Like it seems like regardless of how you explain it in terms of the functional shape, it still seems like there are some trials in which there's not discriminatory evidence in the source. What am I trying to say? There's not good source information. So whether or not you describe that as guessing or just like very, very low precision doesn't really change, I guess, what people are doing. Does that make sense?
Well, to me, it just feels different because the way you talked about the threshold model felt like a two-process model. There's this guessing process and there's this separate retrieval process. Whereas if it's all just a function of memory strength, it feels like a single. I mean, maybe this is a high-level conceptual thing that doesn't matter at the end of the day, but it feels the two accounts feel different, at least to me.
Yeah, I take your point. Yeah, I guess I'm talking more about what the outcome is rather than what the process, whether it's a two-process thing. Yeah, I don't know. I think. No, I'm not really sure I have much else to say about that. I think, it's, this Philip seems to be coming over.
Sorry, Simon has a question over Zoom. That's all right.
Yep, cool.
Can I take this? Because it's actually a follow-up.
Sure.
It was essentially it's a version of Charles's question I began to ask.
Yeah,
and
sure.
So you might just say see above.
Okay.
It was related to these sort of changes in visual working memory literature, which, as you know, started off with this very much due process memory guessing. And in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been this rise of population code models, which was a little bit like what Charles was talking about in terms of continuum. You know, the basic idea is that you basically just got a continuum of naughty detectors, all of which may respond, and there's the memory strength iron, which becomes progressively weaker. And as it becomes progressively weaker, it's just increasingly more likely that one of the other items will respond. So what I was going to ask you is, what do you think is the implication for those kinds of models for the way you've been thinking about threshold versus continuous? Because to me, it looks as though, that's where visual working memory literature is moving at the moment, which is moving away from the idea of two process models. So in a sense, it really is a variant of exactly the same question as Charles. So this was really an invitation to kind of consider what's been happening in the visual working memory literature for the last few years and the implications for you of that.
Yeah. Great question. Wish you'd prepare me earlier. I'm joking. I think like as you say, a lot of these things have been talked about more in the years since I started my PhD. So I think we started with this very kind of rudimentary comparison between threshold and continuous. I think that has kind of been broken down a bit. I think the Shergin, Wixton, and Brady paper, which I think you might be referring to. Yes. I think that there is a sort of step away from this sharp distinction. It is kind of like C above, I think. I don't know how satisfactory that answer was, but it does seem like there are, just some trials in which, regardless of how you explain it in the back end, when you look at the responses, it seems like people just don't have information how they reach that point, whether it is through like this discrete slot thing, which is falling out of favor, or this the more continuous based explanation. The end result is still that people sometimes don't have information driving the source task.
Yeah, and I think you probably but ultimately this may just be a sort of semantic point. Charles is like saying it kind of feels differently semantically, but whether there is any kind of strong psychological interpretation from classifying those differences in semantics, I don't know either. Anyway,
thank you.
Sorry, Zach.
Did Simon have a question?
Simon had a question from Zoom. If you want to chime in, Simon.
Yeah. Okay. I have 2 questions, but I'll just ask one of them, and hopefully the simpler one, maybe.
I would like that.
So typically, right, the semantics does play a fairly substantial role in memory. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why in this paradigm the semantics doesn't seem to be as relevant.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. I did gloss over a lot of nuance here with the semantics. In the first instance, I think we'll just, there's a few things I can say about that. The first is something I mentioned, which is the strength of the manipulation. So real briefly, the top panel here shows the level of orthographic, or the number of occurrences of different orthographic distances in each condition. And so the orthographic lump is really far to the left, right? So it's a really strong difference between that and the other 2 conditions. Whereas in the semantic condition, a semantic manipulation, the blue lump isn't as far away from the others. And that's kind of just a consequence of working with 6-letter words. Like there's a lot of ways you can mess around the letters, but it's a bit harder to mess around the meanings and still keep a list of 10 or 8 items, I think. So that's one part of it, is that the manipulation is different. The other is, I think, I'm going to draw upon my memory here a little bit. I think with semantics, the story isn't like super clear in the literature what semantics is doing, and it seems to have something to do with the tasks as well. So I think like recently I was pointed to this Gilland and Schifrin paper where they looked at the differences between phonology and semantics, and they found that there was this big false alarm thing with orthographic lures and not so much with synonyms. And their explanation, I think, one possible explanation was just people paying attention to different things, like an encoding bias. So people are paying more attention to perceptual features rather than semantic things. And if you think about the task here, when people are doing like free recall tasks, there's this reason why you would associate items with each other, right? Like if you remember aloe, it's beneficial to associate that with the next word. In this source task, there's not any real reason you would do that. It doesn't help you, like associating words with each other doesn't help you remember the source locations. So maybe there's a sort of difference in the task demands, which contributes to what we see in the semantics as well. So I don't know, like a few possible things could be going on there. Yeah, hopefully that satisfies curiosity. Yeah, any burning question, ask me over some KFC.
Okay, thank you. Please join me in thanking Jason for a really terrific talk.
Right. There was one from Meredith, but maybe I'll just email you after. Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! It was just a comment. Okay.
Yes, you're that with shallow processing.
Yeah, it was a pretty shallow task. Pretty shallow thesis, really. All right. Thank you all very much.